Chocolate is the best thing that humans have ever created. A few days before my first birthday, I was in the hospital fighting for my life, and all those medicine would have gone to waste if there wasn't any chocolate for me to eat later in life. Aeroplanes, modern medicine, or even YouTube are all meaningless compared to the greatness that is chocolate. A lot of videos and sources about chocolate cover mostly how it was invented in Central America and then how it spread to Europe, until eventually talking about a couple of modern companies selling chocolate. The problem with this approach is that Earth is much bigger than just Europe and North America. Chocolate is eaten all around the world, and while Europeans and North Americans eat more chocolate on average, the rest of the world has mouths too. So in this video we will talk about the early history of chocolate, how it spread around the world, and how it has become so incredibly popular. So let's jump into chapter 1. Early history. The cocoa tree originated in the Amazon rainforest, but at first they weren't very useful to humans. They could grow up to 20 meters, about 65 feet, meaning that getting the cocoa beans was dangerous. So humans selected the shortest cocoa trees and planted their seeds. Over thousands of years the tree went from 20 meters to just 8 meters today, making harvesting them a lot easier. Over time, the tree was planted north of the Amazon, all the way into Central America. The cocoa beans themselves are bitter, however, they grow within pods, like you can see on screen right now. The pods themselves are sweet, and we think humans first ate the sweet pulp inside the pod and only later learned about the amazing cocoa seeds inside. We don't exactly know when people first started making something with cocoa beans, however. The oldest known consumption dates back to 1400 years BC, with traces of cocoa found in pots in Mesoamerica. And in this time, Mesoamerica was ruled by the Olmecs. They are the people who made these sexy statues. The Olmecs would ferment the cocoa beans until it turned into an alcoholic drink, although we still don't know exactly how they did it. The process was likely complex, which likely means the drink had been around for centuries or even millennia earlier. After all, tribal societies are known for inventing complex technologies within just a single generation. But we do know they probably didn't drink the cocoa beverage for personal use, like we do today with chocolate milk, for example. It seems that cocoa drinks were only used for special occasions such as religious rituals, marriages, or to help sick people. And if you're interested, there are still plenty of cocoa beers around today, so if you want to drink like an Olmec and get stone-faced drunk, you still can. Over thousands of years, the Olmecs were replaced with different ethnic groups. The Mayans, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, and many more. Yet, they all shared their love for cocoa and used them for very similar reasons. For example, both the Mayans and the Aztecs believed the cocoa had a magical or divine property, suitable only for the most sacred parts of life, such as birth, marriage, and death. But they did have different methods of making the cocoa beverages. The Mayans, for example, started with cutting open the cocoa pods to expose the beans and the fleshy pulp. The beans were left out to ferment for a couple of days. In some cases, the beans were roasted over an open fire in order to add a smoky flavor to it. The beans then had their husks removed and were ground into a paste. Since sweeteners were rarely used by the Mayans, they flavored their cocoa paste with flowers, vanilla, and chilies. Although that said, the cocoa drinks were quite bitter even with seasoning. They would put them in special vases that would create a thick layer of foam on top of the drink, which to the Mayans was very important, just as a lot of people find beer with foam important today. We tended to find most of the cocoa beverages in cups and pots and vases that had complicated patterns on them, suggesting that only the rich had access to it, such as nobility and priests. And while there isn't a lot of written text left behind by the Mayans, they came together once a year to the patron god of cocoa, Actua, thanking him for giving humanity cocoa. You know, I think a lot more people would be religious if we still worship the god of chocolate today. In fact, the official name of the cocoa tree is Theobroma coco. Theo meaning god and broma meaning food in Latin. So the tree is literally called food of the gods. And the word cocoa comes from the Mayan word for it, called cacao, and is written like this. The Aztecs made their cocoa drinks a bit differently. They would leave the beans out in the sun until they started to ferment. They would then remove the beans from the seed pods and roasted them while turning them into a paste. They added vanilla, herbs and spices. The paste was then turned into small cakes and placed under trees where they would harden. They'd then take these cakes, break them into little pieces and add hot water to them. They would then stir the drink until it had a layer of foam on top and drink the cocoa beverage while warm. They called this drink xocoatl, meaning bitter water. They sometimes added corn to create a less bitter version of the drink as well. This drink was so valuable to them that they would even use cocoa beans as currency. But why would they do that? Well, the Aztecs couldn't grow cocoa beans themselves for most of their history. The climate was simply too dry and cocoa beans need both a hot and wet environment. So the Aztecs had to import it from various Mayan countries. This meant that you couldn't simply create a whole bunch of new cocoa beans and cause massive inflation. And when you dry the beans, they can be stored for a very long time, while the bean itself is small and lightweight. So you would be able to carry a lot of money, store it for a long time, and be assured that the value of cocoa beans wouldn't suddenly jump up or down. And the only real value a cocoa bean had was as a luxury product, so you didn't have to worry that you might have to eat your money if you ran out of food. This made it a perfect currency. I said it in the Aztec video and I'll say it again. Forget the gold standard, we need the chocolate standard. I want to go to my local bank and exchange my euros directly for chocolate bars. So how much was a cocoa bean worth? Well, an avocado, for example, cost 1 bean. A pumpkin 4 beans. A rabbit was worth 10 cocoa beans. The services for a prostitute usually 8 to 10. And a slave about 100 cocoa beans. So if anyone is still looking for a sub and has some chocolate left over, you can email me at officialhistoryscope@gmail.com. Or maybe you just want to help out the channel, you can do that by liking this video and subscribing. It really helps to spread the video to more people and grow the channel. An interesting thing about cocoa beans is that they can only be grown in specific areas, such as what is today part of southern Mexico all the way to northern South America. However, cocoa was exported well outside these regions. There are reports from the Aztec Empire, the Caribbean, and even the Incan Empire. And interestingly, it appears that cocoa beverages served very similar purposes in all these cultures. A sacred drink from the gods, used in important ceremonies, and used to greet guests and diplomats from other tribes, city-states, or empires. Chapter 2. Europe arrives. After the Europeans arrived, cocoa quickly became popular among the colonizers as well. The Spanish tended to insert themselves into the existing social structures of the Native Americans and created a blend of cultures. And when they discovered cocoa beverages, they grew to like it as well. The cocoa beans would be grown in Guatemala and transported to various colonies in the Caribbean and South America. It was actually quite common in the first century after the Spanish arrived to give cocoa beans to poor beggars instead of giving them coins. The drink was first exported to Europe in 1585 and introduced to the Spanish court. However, the Europeans didn't like it at all, calling the chocolate beverage a bitter drink for pigs. But when they added honey or sugarcane to the drink, they started to love it. When other European countries colonized the Americas, they also began importing cocoa. By the end of the 17th century, cocoa beverages were common among the upper classes of Europe, often consumed with sugar, vanilla, or cinnamon. The first chocolate shop was opened in London in 1657, followed soon after by other European capitals. These were high-class clubs and shops who catered only to the rich. The reason for this is that growing cocoa takes quite a lot of work, making it very expensive. But anything that's expensive is also profitable, especially if you don't have to pay your workers. And so, the first slave plantations for cocoa were created in South America. Particularly the French, Dutch and English colonies in South America and the Caribbean began growing cocoa. But the process of turning a pod of cocoa beans into something you could actually sell was a slow and labor-intensive process. But this changed in 1729, when a British inventor created a mill powered by running water, wind and horses that was able to crush the cocoa pods far easier than humans could. And so it became easy to take the beans out of the pods. A few years later, in 1732, it was discovered that heating up the crushing machine made this process even faster. And for about 100 years, cocoa became more accessible as it required fewer and fewer people to make the same amount of product. But even up until this time, cocoa was used for drinks. They didn't have real chocolate like we think of it today. This would finally change in the 19th century. In 1815, a Dutch chemist wanted to find a way to make cocoa less bitter. He used alkaline salts to create a much less bitter cocoa liquid. But he wasn't done yet, because he also wanted to make the drink less fat. It took him 13 years, but in 1828 he achieved this goal. He created a press that removed about half of the natural fat from the cocoa liquor. This fat was called Dutch cocoa, and while the liquor was still popular and kept being sold, people could now also buy cocoa fat itself, which looks like this and is basically just regular fat. The inventor got a patent for his invention, however, he didn't renew it. As a result, his invention could now be used by anyone, and people all over the world began to innovate on his process. Such as the absolute geniuses who worked at the Joseph S. Fry and Sons, a chocolate factory. In 1847, they discovered that if you melt the cocoa powder, add a bit of cocoa liquor with it, and then put some of the cocoa fat back into the mix, that you create a chocolate paste that you could mold into basically any shape you wanted. And when it cooled down, you had a solid piece of chocolate. And so, the very first chocolate bar was created. And we have finally come to the point where we have actual chocolate the way we know it. Just imagine that before 1847, nobody had ever eaten chocolate. Feel free to press F in the comment section to pay your respects to all the poor souls who lived and died without once tasting the sweet, sweet, delicious chocolate. And this is the packaging it came with. A sad child who becomes happy through eating chocolate. A very relatable marketing campaign. The next major breakthrough came in a man named Daniel Peter. His father-in-law was the creator of the very first Swiss chocolate, and at the age of 21 he came up with the idea of adding milk to chocolate to create chocolate milk. A problem that he had was that adding milk while making chocolate would make the substance too watery and you would essentially create chocolate soup. Here, I tried to make it at home, so my chocolate addiction is now tax deductible. But Daniel Peter had an idea. If he could remove the water from milk, then he could add chocolate powder and milk powder and he'd have milk chocolate. In 1868, Daniel Peter started a partnership with a man called Henry Nestle. Nestle made baby food and had invented a technique to remove water from milk to use in baby formula. But the milk was still too watery at the time. It would take them another 7 years before they finally managed to create a solid piece of milk chocolate, taking them 18 years to go from an idea to a product. Together, they created the Nestle Company and sold the very first milk chocolates in history. And now it is time for that moment in every history video where we need to talk about World War II. Because the Second World War brought another major invention in chocolate. Italy at the time couldn't import the cocoa they needed and they started looking for an alternative. A man named Pietro Ferrero decided to make the chocolate a bit more watery by adding a bit more milk. This way he could sell more chocolate before running out. And then he added hazelnuts, which were commonly grown in Italy at the time. This way he created a paste of hazelnut and chocolate. He would put the chocolate paste on bread and sell them to his customers. And when the war was over, his product was still very popular, so he kept selling it. But instead of selling them on bread, he decided to sell the paste itself in jars in 1951. And in 1964 he changed the name of his chocolate paste to Nutella. Chapter 3. The rest of the world. In the 20th century, chocolate became cheaper and cheaper. Industrialization and new techniques of making chocolate, like we've already discussed, made it easier to make a lot more cocoa products. While cocoa plantations moved away from the Americas and towards Africa and Asia, where cheap labor made it possible to create cheaper cocoa. Chocolate stopped being a food or drink for the rich and started being eaten by everyone. Marketing companies immediately jumped in on this and started advertising chocolate to mothers and housewives, saying that it is a good way to spice things up in the bedroom. But only in Europe and the Americas. Chocolate was barely sold in Africa and Asia. Even today, they are rather small markets compared to the West. But why is that? Why has chocolate never really caught on in those two continents? There appear to be several theories, although I will warn that most of these theories were created by Westerners. The first is that the cultures in Asia emphasized a reluctance for indulgence. As chocolate was often a delicacy among the Europeans, it is theorized that many Asian cultures frowned upon eating something just because it's delicious. Another theory is that chocolate is simply not as appealing to people who use more spices in their food. European cuisine is rather bland, so chocolate is a good way to have something nice in your mouth for once. But none of these theories have substantial evidence behind them, so it remains kind of unclear why chocolate wasn't very popular in Asian countries. But this trend is changing. Asia has become the fastest growing chocolate market in the world, with India, China and Japan in particular growing to like chocolate. The marketing strategy here is to get children to eat the chocolate, so that they will want to keep eating it the rest of their lives. Africa is also one of the regions where chocolate never became all that popular, even in areas like Ivory Coast or Ghana, which produce 70% of the world's cocoa. Between 1961 and 2016, the share of chocolate consumption in Africa grew by 0.9%. In essence, the chocolate market in Africa isn't growing, even though they produce a lot of cocoa in the world. Today, Indonesia is a major supplier of cocoa. Harvesting cocoa is labor-intensive, and Indonesia's salaries are on the rise. As a result, investors are more interested in poorer Africa, where people sometimes work for as little as $50 a day working on cocoa plantations. Countries like Ghana, Ivory Coast, Cameroon and Nigeria are currently investing in more cocoa production, but also in chocolate production. Seeing as they already have the raw materials and have cheap labor, it would allow them to turn the cocoa into more valuable chocolate, which they can sell at a low price to the vast middle classes of Europe, North America and East Asia. It is also hoped that as African countries keep growing their economies, they will create their own large middle classes, which in turn will buy African chocolate. It's honestly a perfect way for certain African countries to develop their economies. And this is the end of the history of chocolate. This was a bit of a shorter video than usual, but one I've been waiting to make for over 2 years. I really like chocolate, and it's a good April 1st video because it's funny, but not annoying. This video was made possible because of all the lovely people on screen right now who are supporting History Scope on Patreon. These two people in particular pledged €15 or more on Patreon and got a drawing of themselves in the video and any future video as long as they're a Patreon.